Today we're going to talk about some of the theories that explain substance abuse disorders. We're going to approach it from a number of different points of view. Remember our multi-dimensional model, that we're going to be looking at, more distal kinds of factors, proximal factors close to us, some reinforcers and punishers. We can think about those distal factors in terms of things that aren't immediately addressing us in terms of biological pieces and impulsivity and peers and our culture, family issues and experiences, and more close proximal issues in terms of what's happening in the brain right now, and stress and depression right now, and peer pressure right now, positive expectancies about drug use and availability of drugs right now. Things that are reinforcers in terms of mood enhancement and relief from stress and belonging and, avoidance of withdrawal symptoms, and punishers including, some of the after effects like a hangover or legal problems and effects on the body and effects on relationships. All of these things impact what's going on for us. So another way of cutting these things up, we'll look at the biological model. We'll look at different pieces in terms of learning. So positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and the opponent process theory. We'll think about some cognitive pieces, especially expectations, and think about some of the issues of culture. So one piece in terms of biological vulnerability comes from twin and adoption studies. For men, and remember that substance abuse disorders are more likely to be identified in men. Children of alcoholics are much more likely to also run into substance problems. People with the DRD2 gene are much more likely to be alcoholics, so about 67% of people identified as alcoholics have the gene. On the other hand, about 20% of people who are not alcoholics have the gene. This is a really whopping big difference, but one of the things we should be thinking about here is, why do some people without the gene still go on to abuse substances or abuse alcohol? And why do some people without or with the gene not? One of the things that we see is that sons of alcoholics sway less when they're drinking. So there aren't as many cues of drinking some of the alcohol use and abuse. Also, our ability to metabolize alcohol seems to affect our use and abuse of alcohol. So about 30 to 50% of Asians are unable to metabolize alcohol, and as a result, we also see much lower rates of alcohol abuse in many Asian populations. We can see, things at a brain level. So, for example, if we're looking at, in this PET scan, we see much more activation of the frontal lobe in a matched control relative to a cocaine abuser. The suggestion is that, there are brain arguments suggesting that, there are fewer inhibitions, more impulsivity that might lead to that. There's also some suggestions about brain activity puts people at greater risk. Regardless, and think back to the DRD2 gene issue, regardless, just because someone is vulnerable to a substance abuse disorder does not mean that it's inevitable. First off, the drug has to be available. Second, the person must choose to use the drug. Not everyone who is around drugs, around alcohol, uses. And third, not everyone who uses the drug and is vulnerable will become dependent. And so, right here, this sort of opens up, from my point of view, opens up how we think about and how we talk about substance abuse with people. Van Deventer, in a My Turn column for Newsweek, talked about his experience with cocaine and being, addicted to cocaine, and how he perceived what should happen. First off, just to sort of broaden our picture of who people abusing cocaine are, Van Deventer was a stock trader, and he argued that there should be barriers out there preventing, making it more difficult for substances to be there. That when those barriers are there, we're less likely to get addicted. We're less likely to even attempt to use a substance. Let's think about substance abuse from a learning approach. Certainly from we can think about it in terms of positive reinforcement. And that positive reinforcement can take any of a number of perspectives, as we saw earlier, in terms of mood, in terms of relief from stress, in terms of belonging, in terms of avoidance of withdrawal. We can also think about it in terms of negative reinforcement. So let me review the difference between positive reinforcement and negative. So positive reinforcement is when something is added, which increases the frequency of the behavior. Negative reinforcement is when something is taken away, which increases the frequency of the behavior. So, for example, with these Vietnam vets, we're seeing much lower rates of substance abuse, heroin abuse, 3 years after returning to the U.S. And the suggestion is that in Vietnam, there were much higher rates of negative things including stress, anxiety, PTSD symptoms, and that heroin and other substances were being used to avoid or remove those painful symptoms. Chassin et al. Argued that, or looked longitudinally at adolescents who reported being lonely, crying, or tense, and those adolescents were much more likely to use drugs as a way of coping with feelings. Notice that it's a way of, this negative reinforcement, removing the bad symptoms, bad feelings, and that these were, you could predict those several years in the future. Finally, cocaine addicts who also were diagnosed with ADHD, when their attention was improved with Ritalin, cocaine use dropped. Again, suggesting that one of the factors involved was negative reinforcement. Now, as we're thinking about what's happening here, think it's probably a little bit more complicated than that. So what you have here are two graphs across time. Initially, in the left figure, we're seeing greater highs initially in the A process and lower or less pronounced lows or hangovers in the B process. So we initially feel really good when we have the substance and don't feel so bad afterwards. For many people and with many substances, the initial high when you're first trying a drug is much greater than later. So in the second figure, you see that the initial high is not so huge, but that the hangover, the withdrawal symptoms are much bigger. And that what proponents of the opponent process theory suggest is that it's initially what gets us to use a drug is the high, but what gets us to keep using the drug is avoiding the B process or the withdrawal. a little bit complicated and yet makes a lot of sense and really has a number of different kinds of implications.